The massive doors of the Galactic Medical Academy slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sight that made James Mitchell pause for just a moment. The lecture hall stretched before him like a cathedral, but instead of wooden pews, it held floating platforms and crystalline structures designed for beings that defied everything he thought he knew about biology. His new students were already assembled, waiting for their first human instructor. James had read the files, studied the species profiles, but seeing them in person was something else entirely. The Lumari students looked like living diamonds, their bodies made of translucent crystal that caught and scattered the room's artificial light into rainbow patterns across the walls. They stood perfectly still, but James could see soft pulses of light moving through their forms like a heartbeat made visible. The drifters floated near the ceiling, their jellyfish-like bodies filled with glowing gases that swirled and changed color as they breathed. Thin tentacles hung beneath them, occasionally twitching with what James hoped was curiosity rather than hunger. Their movements were hypnotic, like watching aurora dance in a night sky. Near the back, the shellwalkers sat in perfect formation. Their metallic bodies gleamed under the lights, each one a masterpiece of biological engineering that looked more like advanced robots than living creatures. Optical sensors focused on him with mechanical precision, and he could hear the soft whir of internal systems processing information. James walked to the center of the room, his soft footsteps echoing in the silence. Every species here had evolved differently. The Lumari could regrow entire limbs given enough time and minerals. The drifters had multiple redundant organ systems floating in their gas-filled bodies. The shellwalkers were nearly indestructible, their organic components protected by natural armor plating that could stop plasma bolts. And then there was him. Soft skin, fragile bones, no backup organs, no natural armor, no regeneration abilities. By galactic standards, humans were walking medical emergencies waiting to happen. "Good morning," James said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustics. Several Lumari students pulsed brighter, which he had learned was their equivalent of polite attention. The drifters descended slightly, bringing their sensory organs closer to hear better. One of the shellwalkers spoke, its voice a pleasant mechanical tone. "Instructor Mitchell, we have studied your species' medical files. How do humans survive in hostile environments without natural protective features?" It was a fair question. James had been asking himself the same thing since arriving at the academy 3 days ago. Every other species here seemed built for survival in ways humans simply were not. He had watched Lumari students practice medicine by literally reshaping their crystal bodies into surgical tools. Drifters could survive in vacuum by simply holding their breath for hours. Shellwalkers could walk through fire without concern. "That is exactly what we are going to explore together," James replied. "Human medicine developed differently because we had to adapt differently." A Lumari student pulsed with curiosity. "But instructor, your species manual indicates humans experience pain from minor tissue damage. How do you function in medical emergencies?" James smiled. The question revealed something interesting about how other species viewed pain. For the Lumari, physical damage simply triggered automatic regeneration protocols. For drifters, their distributed biology meant localized damage rarely affected overall function. Shellwalkers had built-in pain dampening systems. "Pain serves a different purpose for humans," James explained, walking closer to his students. "It is not just a damage indicator. It is also a survival tool. It tells us about problems before they become critical." Another shellwalker tilted its head with mechanical precision. "But surely pain would prevent effective medical response." "Actually, the opposite is true," James said. "Humans have learned to work through pain because we had to. On our world, stopping to heal completely often meant death. So we developed ways to keep functioning while damaged." The room fell silent except for the soft humming of the shellwalkers' internal systems and the gentle chiming of Lumari communication frequencies. James could see his students processing this information, trying to understand how a species could voluntarily continue operating while experiencing distress signals. A young drifter descended further, its tentacles curling with what James had learned indicated deep thought. "Instructor Mitchell, are you saying humans ignore their body's warning systems?" "Not ignore," James clarified. "We listen to them, assess the situation, and decide whether the warning requires immediate action or whether we can address it while continuing our primary mission." The concept seemed to fascinate and horrify his students in equal measure. James could see doubt in their body language. The Lumari students' light patterns had shifted to deeper, more concerned hues. Several drifters had released small clouds of bioluminescent particles, which he had learned was a sign of stress. "Tomorrow we will begin practical exercises," James announced. We will start with basic human trauma response in simulated emergency conditions. As his students filed out through doors sized for their various anatomies, James heard fragments of their conversations. The universal translators picked up worried discussions about dangerous human practices and voluntary tissue damage protocols. Dr. Emma Blake appeared at his shoulder, having watched the class from the observation deck. They think you are planning to hurt yourself, do they not? James chuckled. They have no idea what human medicine actually looks like in practice. Tomorrow will be quite educational. For them or for you? James considered the question as he watched his students disappear into the academy's corridors, still discussing the strange human instructor who talked about working through pain as if it were normal. Probably both. The training chamber hummed with energy as holographic debris materialized around them. James floated in the center of the zero-gravity environment, surrounded by his alien students who moved through the space with varying degrees of grace. The Lumari glided effortlessly, their crystalline bodies catching and reflecting the chamber's lights. The drifters seemed completely at home, their gas-filled forms pulsing gently as they navigated between obstacles. Even the shell walkers managed the weightless environment well, their mechanical systems compensating for the lack of gravity. Remember, James called out as he pushed off from a floating platform, in real emergencies, you will not have perfect conditions. Equipment fails. Gravity generators break down. You must learn to provide medical care while everything around you is falling apart. The holographic scenario showed a damaged spacecraft corridor, complete with sparking electrical panels, twisted metal beams, and floating debris. James had designed it to simulate the kind of chaotic environment where human medics often had to work. His students followed him through the obstacle course, their various forms of locomotion creating an almost ballet-like scene in the artificial wreckage. A Lumari student named Bright Thought pulsed with a question. Instructor Mitchell, how do humans maintain precision in such unstable conditions? James smiled as he maneuvered around a large piece of simulated hull plating. Practice and adaptation. We learn to work with instability instead of fighting against it. He demonstrated by using his momentum to spin around a twisted beam, showing how human flexibility could turn obstacles into advantages. His students watched carefully, their various sensory organs tracking his movements. The exercise was going perfectly until James decided to show them a more advanced technique. Watch this, he called out, preparing to demonstrate how human medics could use debris as anchor points during emergency procedures. He reached out to grab what appeared to be a stable beam, intending to show how to brace against it while treating a patient. The holographic beam was exactly where it should be, but James had miscalculated the position of a real structural support that extended into the training area. His shoulder struck the actual metal beam with tremendous force, the impact sending shockwaves through his entire body. The sound was awful. First came the dull thud of flesh meeting metal, then something much worse. A wet, organic pop that seemed to echo through the chamber despite the lack of atmosphere to carry sound properly. James felt his shoulder joint separate, the ball sliding out of its socket with a sensation that was part pain, part pressure, and entirely wrong. He spun helplessly in the zero gravity, his left arm now hanging at an angle that defied normal human anatomy. The limb floated beside him like a broken wing, completely disconnected from his conscious control. Pain shot through his nervous system in waves, each pulse making his vision flash white at the edges. Emergency protocol activated, announced the chamber's computer system as sensors detected his distress. Medical emergency detected. Initiating emergency response. Bright Thought's crystalline form flared with alarm patterns so intense that other Lumari students throughout the chamber began resonating in sympathetic frequencies. The sound was like a crystal chandelier being struck by lightning, high-pitched and urgent. Instructor down. Critical injury detected. Pulsed Wave Rider, a drifter whose gas-filled body had turned bright red with distress chemicals. Thin tentacles released emergency pheromones that triggered biological alarm responses in nearby students. The shell walkers responded with mechanical precision, their systems switching to emergency mode. Optical sensors focused on James while internal computers calculated injury severity and response protocols. Analyzing. Significant joint displacement detected. Probable bone separation. Recommending immediate stasis field deployment. James drifted through the zero gravity, fighting waves of nausea as his nervous system processed the injury. His shoulder felt like someone had driven a hot spike through it, then twisted it for good measure. But beneath the pain, his medical training was already working. Assess the situation. Identify the problem. Determine the solution. Cancel emergency response, he managed to say through gritted teeth, his voice tight with controlled pain. The computer hesitated. Instructor Mitchell, medical sensors indicate severe trauma requiring immediate intervention. I said cancel it, James repeated, more firmly this time. He could see his students clustering around him, their various forms creating a living constellation of concern in the artificial space. Every species represented here had never seen anything like this before. For the Lamari, injuries triggered automatic regeneration sequences that sealed damage and began rebuilding tissue. For drifters, their distributed anatomy meant that losing function in one area barely affected their overall capabilities. Shellwalkers had multiple redundant systems and armor plating that prevented this kind of injury entirely. None of them had ever witnessed a creature continue to function while visibly damaged, let alone remain conscious and giving orders while their body was clearly compromised. Instructor, Wave Rider pulsed urgently, you must remain motionless until medical drones arrive. Movement will increase tissue damage. Your biological systems are clearly compromised, added a Shellwalker student designated as Precision Logic. Continuing activity while injured defies all medical protocols. James rotated slowly in the weightless environment, his damaged arm trailing beside him like a broken antenna. His students watched in fascination and horror as the human instructor did something that went against every medical instinct they possessed. Instead of waiting for help, instead of activating emergency stasis fields, instead of calling for regeneration chambers, James was clearly preparing to take action himself. His right hand moved toward his injured shoulder with deliberate purpose. James gripped his upper arm with his right hand, his fingers finding the familiar landmarks he had learned during his medical training. The pain was incredible, like lightning shooting through his nervous system with every small movement, but he had felt this before. During his military service, in emergency rooms, in the field where waiting for proper medical equipment meant the difference between life and death. His alien students formed a horrified circle around him in the zero gravity, their various forms of communication creating a chaos of distress signals. The Lamari students pulsed with rapid, panicked light patterns that painted the chamber walls in frantic rainbows. Their crystalline bodies were resonating at frequencies that made the very air vibrate with their alarm. Instructor Mitchell, cease all movement immediately, commanded Precision Logic, the Shellwalker's mechanical voice tight with something that might have been fear. You are causing additional damage to compromised biological systems. Wave Rider released another cloud of distress pheromones, the chemical signals so strong that the chamber's air filtration systems began working overtime. Please remain still. Medical intervention is required before any movement can be attempted. But James was not listening to their pleas. His medical training had taken over, the same instincts that had kept him alive in combat zones and emergency situations where help was minutes or hours away. He positioned his elbow against his torso, using his body weight to create the leverage he needed. Everyone stay calm, James said, though his voice was strained and sweat beaded on his forehead. This is going to look worse than it is. Bright Thought's light patterns shifted to what could only be described as pure terror. Instructor, you cannot perform medical procedures on yourself. It is impossible. Your pain responses will prevent accurate treatment. James almost smiled at that. If only they knew how many times human medics had treated their own injuries in the field. How many soldiers had reset their own broken bones, stitched their own wounds, or administered their own emergency medications because there was no other choice. Watch and learn, James said, then did something that would be discussed in medical journals across the galaxy for decades to come. He pulled his arm outward while simultaneously pushing his shoulder in the opposite direction. The joint, which had been sitting wrong for several minutes now, suddenly snapped back into place with a sound that was both wet and sharp. The noise echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, followed immediately by a softer grinding sound as cartilage and bone found their proper alignment again. The reaction from his students was immediate and overwhelming. 3 drifters immediately lost consciousness, their gas-filled bodies deflating as they fainted in midair. Their tentacles went limp, and they began drifting like colorful balloons with the air let out. 2 other drifters released massive clouds of what James now recognized as panic chemicals, filling their section of the chamber with bioluminescent fog. The Lamari students created a sound unlike anything James had ever heard. Their harmonic frequencies reached levels that triggered the chamber's noise control systems. Several of them actually cracked, thin lines appearing in their crystalline structures as their internal resonance went chaotic with shock. Even the Shellwalkers, with their mechanical calm, began displaying error messages. Optical sensors flickered as their programming struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Warning lights flashed on their metallic bodies as internal systems tried to categorize the event and failed to find any existing protocols that matched. Impossible, whispered Precision Logic, his voice distorting as his vocal processors glitched. Biological systems cannot override pain responses to perform major medical procedures. James rotated his shoulder experimentally, testing the joint. It moved normally, though it ached with the familiar throb of recently relocated bone. The sharp, electric pain was gone, replaced by the manageable discomfort that would fade over the next few hours. See? James said, lifting his arm to demonstrate full range of motion. Good as new. Wave Rider, who had managed to avoid fainting, pulsed with confused colors. But the pain? We could detect your stress responses from here. How did you function through such intense signals? Pain is just information, James explained, continuing to test his shoulder. It tells you something is wrong, but it does not have to control what you do about it. A young Lamari named Claesong managed to pulse a weak question. You have done this before? Many times, James confirmed. Dislocated shoulders are common injuries for humans. We learn to fix them ourselves because waiting for help is not always possible. The silence that followed was profound. Even the chamber's background system seemed quieter, as if the entire facility was trying to process what had just occurred. James could see his students looking at him with something that had not been there before. It was not quite respect yet, but it was no longer the polite concern they showed for a fragile species. For the first time since arriving at the academy, James felt like his students were truly seeing humans not as primitive beings who somehow survived despite their limitations, but as something else entirely. Something that could take damage that would incapacitate other species and simply fix itself without outside help. Now then, James said, pushing off from a nearby wall to demonstrate that he was indeed fully functional again, shall we continue with the lesson? The look of absolute bewilderment on his students' faces told him that the real education was just beginning. The emergency medical board convened in the academy's most formal chamber, a circular room with walls that shifted color to match the emotional states of its occupants. Right now, those walls flickered between deep red alarm patterns and the sickly yellow-green of confusion and distress. Dr. Emma Blake sat across from three of the galaxy's most respected medical authorities, feeling like she was about to defend her entire species. The massive Lamari physician called Crystal Mind towered over the table, his crystalline form pulsing with slow, deliberate patterns that indicated deep concern. Beside him, the ancient drifter known as Void Whisper floated in his specialized chair, his gas-filled body rippling with waves of confusion. The third member of the board was Steelheart, a shell walker whose optical sensors had been focused on Emma with unblinking intensity since she entered the room. Dr. Blake, Crystal Mind began, his voice creating harmonic frequencies that made the air itself sing. We must discuss the disturbing incident involving your human colleague. Instructor Mitchell displayed clear signs of severe psychological breakdown in front of his students. Emma had been expecting this conversation since the moment James had relocated his shoulder in the training chamber. The reports had reached the medical board within minutes, carried by traumatized students who could barely describe what they had witnessed without triggering their own stress responses. With respect, Dr. Crystal Mind, Emma replied carefully, Commander Mitchell performed a standard human medical procedure. He relocated a dislocated joint. Void Whisper's tentacles curled in what Emma recognized as the drifter equivalent of disbelief. His voice bubbled through the chemical atmosphere he breathed, creating words that seemed to emerge from underwater. Dr. Blake, we have reviewed the recordings. Your human deliberately inflicted severe trauma upon himself while experiencing obvious distress. This is classic self-destructive behavior. Steelheart's mechanical voice cut through the conversation with precise clarity. The human's biometric readings showed extreme stress during the incident. Pain responses were off our measurement scales. Yet he continued to manipulate the injury site despite clear damage indicators. This suggests either complete disconnection from reality or severe malfunction of his nervous system. Emma pulled up a holographic display of human anatomy, the three-dimensional image rotating slowly in the center of the table. She had prepared for this meeting by gathering every piece of medical data about human physiology that existed in the galactic database. What she had found was both impressive and terrifying from an alien perspective. Gentlemen, she began, using the universal term of respect, I think we need to discuss what you understand about human evolution and medical practices. Crystal Mind's light patterns shifted to deeper blues, indicating he was prepared to listen but remained skeptical. We have studied your species files, Dr. Blake. Humans lack natural regeneration, redundant organ systems, and protective carapaces. By all medical standards, your species should have died out long ago. That is exactly the point, Emma said, highlighting the human skeletal system in the hologram. We did not evolve natural armor or regeneration because we evolved something else instead. We learned to function through damage. She manipulated the display to show common human injuries and their treatment methods. Broken bones that could be set and healed without technological intervention. Wounds that could be stitched closed using primitive tools. Joint dislocations that could be corrected through manual manipulation. Void Whisper released a small puff of nervous gas. But the pain responses, how can any biological system override such intense warning signals? Because for humans, pain is not meant to shut us down, Emma explained. It is meant to provide information. A dislocated shoulder tells us that something needs to be fixed, but it does not mean we stop functioning until someone else fixes it. Steelheart's optical senses focused more intently on the display. You are suggesting that humans voluntarily experience high levels of distress in order to maintain operational capability. Every day, Emma confirmed. Human soldiers continue fighting while wounded. Our medical personnel work through exhaustion and injury to treat patients. Our athletes push through pain barriers that would incapacitate most species. We call it determination. The room fell silent except for the soft humming of Steelheart's processors and the gentle bubbling of Void Whisper's breathing apparatus. Emma could see that the concept was difficult for them to understand. Each of their species had evolved different solutions to the problem of survival. Crystal Mind had learned to regenerate damage automatically. His people could lose entire limbs and regrow them given enough time and mineral supplements. The idea of living with temporary damage was foreign to them. Void Whisper's people had distributed biology. Damage to one part of their gas-filled bodies barely affected their overall function. They had never needed to develop tolerance for systemic pain because their anatomy prevented it from occurring. Steelheart's people had evolved natural armor and redundant systems. They prevented damage rather than enduring it, and their mechanical components could be repaired or replaced without the biological system ever experiencing distress. Dr. Blake, Crystal Mind said slowly, his harmonics dropping to frequencies that indicated he was reconsidering everything he thought he knew. Are you telling us that human medicine is based on the principle of accepting damage and continuing to function while implementing repairs? Emma nodded. We call it field medicine. The ability to provide medical care under adverse conditions, often including treating yourself or continuing to work while injured. Steelheart's senses clicked as they refocused. This would explain the reports we have received about human military medics. We thought the stories were exaggerated. What stories? Emma asked. Humans treating wounded soldiers while under enemy fire. Medics continuing to work after being injured themselves. Field surgeons operating without proper equipment or facilities. Steelheart paused, his processes clearly working overtime. We assumed these were propaganda tales designed to make your species appear more formidable than they actually were. Void Whisper's tentacles straightened with sudden understanding. But they were not exaggerations. No, Emma said quietly. They were not. 6 months after the shoulder incident, James Mitchell stood before the largest gathering of medical professionals the galaxy had ever seen. The Grand Medical Symposium brought together healers, physicians, and researchers from every known species, all crowded into the massive amphitheater on Central Station. The curved walls displayed real-time translations in hundreds of languages, while specialized atmosphere processors maintained breathing conditions for dozens of different life forms. James looked out at the sea of faces, tentacles, optical sensors, and crystalline forms, knowing that half of them had come specifically to see the human who had shocked the medical community by treating himself. The other half had come to learn the techniques that were already saving lives across 12 star systems. The fundamental principle of human field medicine, James explained, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's advanced acoustics, is immediate function over immediate comfort. Sometimes the best medical response is to accept temporary pain in exchange for continued capability. In the front row, his former students sat with obvious pride. Bright Thought had become the first Lamari to specialize in emergency trauma medicine, his crystalline body now modified with specialized formations that could serve as medical tools. The modifications had been painful, requiring him to literally reshape parts of himself, but he had embraced the human concept of enduring discomfort for greater capability. Wave Rider floated nearby, his gas-filled body now carrying specialized chemical compounds that could provide emergency pain relief to other species. He had spent weeks learning to tolerate the uncomfortable sensations of carrying foreign substances in his system, inspired by watching James function through his shoulder injury. Even Precision Logic had adapted human concepts, upgrading his mechanical systems with sensors that could detect when biological beings were pushing through pain responses. His programming now included algorithms for recognizing when a patient was attempting to continue functioning despite injury, allowing him to provide more appropriate care. The holographic display showed a three-dimensional model of James performing the shoulder relocation, slowed down and annotated with medical data that explained each step of the process. The audience watched with fascination as the human anatomy moved in ways that seemed impossible to most species. The key insight, James continued, is understanding that pain is information, not instruction. When my shoulder dislocated, the pain told me what was wrong and where. It did not tell me to stop functioning. A question came from the audience, transmitted through the universal communication system. A representative of the spiral shell species, beings who lived in protective armor that prevented almost all physical damage, asked, "Instructor Mitchell, how does your species train for such extreme pain tolerance?" James smiled, remembering his own training. "We start young. Human children learn to walk by falling down repeatedly. They experience pain, assess the damage, and continue trying. By adulthood, most humans have experienced hundreds of minor injuries and learned to function through them." Crystal Mind, who had become one of James's strongest supporters since the medical board hearing, pulsed with interested patterns. "The human approach has revolutionized our understanding of emergency medicine," he announced to the assembly. "We have incorporated human pain tolerance training into our curriculum, and our response times have improved by 40%. The presentation continued with case studies from across the galaxy. A Lumari medic had saved 3 lives during a station fire by continuing to work despite thermal damage that should have triggered complete regeneration shutdown. A drifter emergency responder had maintained consciousness through decompression injuries that would normally cause immediate system failure. Shellwalker combat medics had learned to override their protective protocols when necessary to reach wounded soldiers. Human techniques, James explained, are not about ignoring your body's signals. They are about listening to those signals and making informed decisions about how to respond. Dr. Emma Blake watched from the wings as James demonstrated the shoulder relocation technique on a holographic human model. The audience, which would have been horrified 6 months ago, now took careful notes and asked detailed questions about joint mechanics and pain management. After the main presentation, the symposium broke into smaller workshops where species representatives learned to adapt human concepts to their own biology. Lumari students practiced controlled regeneration while maintaining function. Drifters learned to redistribute their gas-filled organs while continuing cognitive tasks. Shellwalkers modified their protective responses to allow for tactical decision-making during emergencies. But perhaps the most significant change was not in technique but in perspective. The galactic medical community had always viewed humans as a species that survived despite their weaknesses. Now they understood that what they had seen as weaknesses were actually specialized strengths. Commander Mitchell approached an elderly shellwalker whose optical senses gleamed with respect. "My species has requested that you establish a training facility on our homeworld. We wish to learn what you call battlefield medicine." Similar requests had been coming in for months. The human concepts of triage, field surgery, and pain management had applications far beyond what James had initially imagined. Military medical units wanted to learn how to keep soldiers functional during combat. Emergency responders wanted techniques for working in hostile environments. Even civilian hospitals were adopting human approaches to patient care. As the symposium concluded, James found himself surrounded by alien medical professionals who treated him not as a curiosity from a primitive species, but as a teacher whose insights had expanded their understanding of what medicine could be. "Funny how things change," Emma commented as they walked through the station's corridors afterward. James nodded, thinking about his students and how far they had all come. They used to think we were too fragile for real medicine. And now? James paused as a group of young Lumari medical students passed by, their crystalline forms already showing the structural modifications that would allow them to practice human-style emergency medicine. Now they are sending their best students to Earth to learn how to be as tough as humans. The galaxy, it seemed, had finally understood that sometimes the best way to survive was not to avoid damage, but to push through it.